My name is Ray Harmon. I was 42 when this happened. And if you had asked me back then whether I believed in monsters, I would have told you no and kept unloading freight. I lived outside Marquette in the Upper Peninsula, drove refrigerated loads for a living, and trusted numbers more than stories. If a thing was real, you could measure it. You could put a light on it, put a tool against it, check it twice, and get the same answer both times. That was how I stayed steady after my divorce. Work, routine, and quiet kept my head from wandering into places that did not help. I ran produce and frozen goods south every winter when freight patterns shifted. Most guys hated those lanes because they mixed bad weather with tight delivery windows. But I liked the predictability. I checked tire pressure at the same intervals, logged fuel down to tenths, ran my pre-trip in the same sequence every morning, and kept my cab clean enough that a dropped bolt or loose fuse would stand out. I drove a long-nosed sleeper with a reefer trailer that had seen better paint but a strong unit, and I knew every rattle in that truck like a person knows his own knees. Weather was math, traffic was timing, and breakdowns were usually somebody skipping basic maintenance. Home time meant frozen lakes and as little conversation as possible. I had a flip shelter, a sonar unit, 2 rods I trusted, and a beat-up thermos that always tasted like yesterday's coffee, no matter how hard I scrubbed it. I would set up on Lake Gogebic or one of the smaller inland waters, depending on ice reports, drill, scan, and sit for hours, listening to wind rub over the flat white surface. It was honest quiet. Not lonely quiet. There is a difference, and guys who have gone through a split know it. My ex-wife and I were civil for our son, but civil is not the same as easy. On the ice, I did not have to perform being fine. I could just be still. People picture truckers as either loud and reckless or half asleep and sloppy. The good ones are neither. The good ones are boring on purpose. I packed my clothes in the same order every trip, ran one paper atlas even with GPS, and carried backup batteries for everything from my headlamp to my tire gauge. At a fuel stop outside Green Bay, one driver I knew from winter lanes leaned on my mirror and said, "Ray, you still carrying that old gauge? They make digital now, fancy screen, beeps at you and all that." I told him, "This one never needed charging and never lied to me." He laughed, called me prehistoric, and I told him prehistoric still showed up on time. That was about as playful as I got, that January had a hard, cold snap, pushing farther south than usual. Dispatch sent me a produce pickup out of eastern Tennessee after I dropped in Indiana. It was one of those weird weather weeks where Michigan felt normal and the South felt confused, with local stations talking about black ice like it was a once-in-a-decade event. I remember grinning at that while crossing into Tennessee because I had chained up in worse and watched snow erase mile markers in front of my hood. I was not cocky about weather, not really, but I did think I understood cold better than most people I met down there. The pickup was near a patchwork of 2-lane roads outside a place locals called Miller's Creek, tucked between low ridges and limestone cuts, where the road bent with the water instead of fighting it. A few houses sat back from the shoulder with old tractors parked like retired workhorses, and the creek itself ran dark and narrow, with willow tangles crowding the banks. There was a bait and tackle shop with 1 gas pump, a faded soda sign, and 2 porch cats that looked like they owned the county. I fueled, checked the reefer, and decided to overnight nearby before my morning dock time. It seemed straightforward. Cold, quiet, and out of the way. My kind of stop. Inside the bait shop, a man in a knit cap rang up my coffee and a pack of peanut butter crackers. He looked at my Michigan plates through the window and said, "You staying out by the creek tonight, driver?" I said I was planning to, just one night. And he gave a small shrug that could have meant nothing. "Gets real still out there in this weather," he said. "Too still sometimes." I asked if he meant ice and slick roads. He said, "Roads too. Just keep your lights up and your doors locked." I thought it was local caution for an out-of-state guy, and told him I had seen worse nights up north. He nodded, not smiling much, and handed me my change. I parked in a gravel pull-off used by anglers and utility trucks, nose angled for an easy exit because that was habit, not fear. I took a walk before dark to loosen my back and check footing around the lot. Frost had edged the weeds silver, and breath hung in front of my face in clean little clouds. From the ridge side, you could hear water moving over shallow rock, a steady, narrow sound, like someone slowly tearing cloth. I remember telling myself, half amused, that southern winter had a lot of drama for not much snow. I made coffee on my small burner, filled out logs, checked weather again, and watched dusk slide down the tree line in layers of blue and gray. The first thing that felt wrong was not a sound. It was the absence of one. I noticed there were no frogs by the creek, and that by itself was nothing because cold knocks them quiet. Then I realized I had not heard a single dog bark from the nearest houses for at least 20 minutes, and rural dogs always bark at something, especially a parked semi they do not recognize. I stood by my driver's side step listening hard, hands in my jacket pockets, and got only water noise and a light click from cooling engine metal. Then over maybe 5 minutes, even the insect buzz dropped out until the whole valley seemed held in place. Not peaceful. Paused. I walked toward the bank with my flashlight. Not far, just enough to check that I was not imagining things. The mud by the creek had thawed into a slick, dark strip where prints held shape. At first I saw what I took for canid tracks. Big but not crazy, maybe from a large stray or somebody's roaming farm dog. I followed them with the beam and watched the pattern stretch. The front impressions began landing farther apart than made sense. Then the sequence shifted into a stride that looked bipedal, like something had gone from 4 down to 2, with toe spread wider than a man's boot, and claw punctures sunk too deep for any tread. I crouched and put my tire gauge beside one print. The claw marks were set ahead of where toes should have ended. Long, narrow, and cleanly punched in. I figured the ground was soft and distorting shape. I ran the logic again that 2 animals had crossed the same line and made a confusing pattern in bad light. I told myself I had been driving 11 hours and my eyes were tired from highway glare. Then the wind changed and brought a smell that didn't fit any of those explanations. Wet fur, sour and heavy, with a rank edge like old meat left in a closed shed. It came and went in pulses, strong enough to taste, then gone again as if whatever carried it moved between me and the breeze. Behind me, my truck electronics flickered once, dash lights dimming and returning, though the battery read clean earlier. 10 seconds later, it flickered again. No alarm, no fault code, just a quick brownout and recovery. I looked back toward the bait shop porch because a shape moved there, and both cats were frozen at the edge of the boards. They were not crouched to pounce. They were locked stiff, ears flattened, staring at the tree line across from my truck. I took 3 steps toward them and made a soft, clicking sound with my tongue, the way I do with barn cats at home. Neither one looked at me. Their eyes tracked together, unwavering, as if something in those trees had all of their attention and mine did not matter. I felt my shoulders tighten without deciding to. That old driver instinct kicked in, the one that says, check systems, check exits, keep options open. So I ran through the practical list. Stray dogs could explain scent and maybe tracks. Bear sign got misread all the time by people who wanted a story, and black bear can make odd impressions in soft mud. Electrical flicker might be a loose ground cable I had not caught on pre-trip. Silence could be weather pressure. Cats were cats. I repeated those points in my head like torque specs while I took measurements, photographed the prints with a ruler app and my gauge for scale, and checked my battery terminals with a light. Tight. Clean. No corrosion. I circled the truck, scanned under the trailer, looked for prankers, looked for campfire glow, looked for any ordinary thing I could point to and be done. I found snapped saplings at the creek edge with fresh pale wood exposed about 8 feet up, bent, not chopped, as if something had pushed through without caring what was in its way. I stood under one and raised my arm to compare height. My fingertips were still well below the brake. Maybe 2 people had horseplayed there with a truck jack handle. Maybe storm damage finished what wind started. Maybe. The maybes were getting thin, and I knew it. I also knew I was not ready to call dispatch and say I was spooked by quiet woods in Tennessee. I had driven through black ice and whiteouts for 20 years. I was not about to lose my nerve over shadows and smells. By full dark, I had moved the truck 10 yards so my nose pointed directly at the road and my trailer boxed one side of the pull-off. I set my flare gun on the passenger seat, where I could reach it fast. Not because I expected trouble, I reasoned, but because flares were useful on icy shoulders, and this was unfamiliar ground. I kept the cab lights off, sat with my coffee cooling between my hands, and listened. Water over stone. A faint tick from the reefer cycling. My own breath, too loud in the cab. Outside the windshield, the tree line held still and black, and every few minutes the wind shifted just enough to carry that wet fur smell back through the vents before disappearing again. I did not sleep much that night, and when I did drift, I woke with the same thought each time. Something out there was watching the truck and waiting for me to make a mistake. At around 1:30, the reefer cycled down, and the quiet that rushed in felt physical, like pressure against my eardrums. I sat upright and listened for the usual follow-up sounds. A truck on the county road, a dog chain rattling, a porch door somewhere. Nothing came. Even the creek seemed lower, like the water had tucked itself under stone. I told myself it was just nighttime acoustics and a hollow sound getting swallowed by the ridges. I wrapped both hands around the thermos cap and waited for my pulse to settle. It did not settle. 5 minutes later, there was a single knock on the trailer wall behind the sleeper. Not loud. Solid. Knuckle hard. Not branch scrape. I held still, counting breaths. Then heard it again. 2 taps spaced evenly, as if somebody was checking thickness. My first thought was a local kid messing with an out-of-state rig. My second thought was worse, because no flashlight beam moved across the gravel and no footsteps crunched after the taps. I reached for my handheld light, cracked the passenger curtain, and swept the side mirror, trailer tires, and the open lane behind me. Empty. I climbed down anyway because staying in the cab with my imagination was starting to feel less rational than checking once and being done. Cold hit my face hard. My boots made the only noise in that lot. I walked the trailer length with my light angled low, looking for tracks, dropped tools, prank gear, anything. Halfway down, I found 3 fresh marks in the frost on the aluminum panel, each one vertical and about the length of my middle finger, cut through road grime down to bright metal. They were too clean to be random. Not deep enough to bend skin, just scored, deliberate, spaced like a hand had tested the surface. I backed away from the trailer and scanned the tree line. That was when the smell hit full strength. Wet fur and spoiled meat, so strong it stung the back of my throat. It rolled in a wave and then thinned, but not all the way. The breeze was coming from the creek toward me, and whatever carried that odor was down there, moving. I kept the beam on the brush edge and listened. A branch ticked once, then silence again. My right hand tightened around the flashlight barrel until my knuckles ached. I hated how aware I was of my own height out there, a man in open gravel lit up by his own light. I got back in the cab, locked both doors, and started the engine just for noise and control. Gauges read normal. Voltage held steady. I kicked on high beams and lit the tree line in a flat white band that turned trunks into bars and brush into torn black shapes. For 10 seconds there was nothing. Then 2 reflections appeared between 2 cedars across from my bumper, amber green and level with each other, set far too high to belong to any deer standing on that grade. They did not blink. They did not bob. They stayed fixed, like they had been there the whole time, and my lights only revealed them. I switched off the engine to hear better. The headlights stayed on battery and painted those eyes without shaking. From outside and slightly right of the hood, I heard breathing, deep and wet, with a slow intake that caught in the throat before a rough exhale. Not panting, not snorting like a buck. It sounded like a chest with volume, close enough that I could map the distance in my head. Maybe 25 yards at first, then 20. The eyes lowered by inches and slid left behind brush without losing that level spacing, as if the head was moving on a body that stayed balanced for speed. I wanted to call someone right then, but even as my hand moved toward my phone, one of those practical little lies slid in to protect me. Reflection can trick depth. Fog can bend light. Breathing could be creek echo. I had made a career out of rejecting panic, and part of me still believed panic was the real danger. I kept watching. The reflections vanished. 10 seconds passed. Then I heard gravel click behind my trailer, a careful 3-step rhythm. Pause, 3 steps, pause, circling in an arc that matched the outside edge of the lot. Predators test wind and angles. I knew that from winter coyotes on the ice. Whatever was out there was not wandering. It was working the perimeter. I hit the air horn for less than a second. The blast punched through the valley and came back off limestone. Immediately there was a crash in the brush, heavy mass forcing through saplings, then splashing at the creek bank. I held the horn again and kept it down this time until my ears rang and my chest vibrated against the seatbelt. The moving sound went downstream fast, then cut off. No yelp, no bark, no scrambling retreat like a spooked dog. Just movement with purpose. And then nothing. I left the lights on and waited another hour with my flare gun in my lap, head turning between mirrors every 10 seconds, like I was backing into a blind dock. Near first light, when the sky was barely gray, I got out with my phone camera and measured what I could, while prints still held shape. Tracks ran along the outside of my trailer, not random crossings, but a clean path that paralleled my rig from landing gear to cab and back again. Some impressions looked canid at first glance, long toes and claw tips. But then the stride length opened and the rear impressions deepened like weight was loading on 2 points instead of 4. One print near my driver door was so close to the step that if I had opened the door at the wrong moment, I could have dropped right onto it. The mud at that spot was gouged in a half circle, as if something had planted and pivoted toward the cab. That was the sign that ended my last easy explanation. Animals pass through. They do not usually pace a truck in darkness and map where the driver climbs down. I told myself not to dramatize, but I had spent too many nights alone at truck stops and pull-offs not to recognize intent. I started the engine, rolled out slow, and did not look back until Miller's Creek was in the mirror and growing smaller. I pulled into the diner by the highway junction just after sunrise, still wired and running on almost no sleep. The place was warm, smelled like bacon grease and burned coffee, and had 3 men at the counter talking weather. Normal noise helped for about 2 minutes. Then I saw dried mud on my cuffs and remembered exactly how high those eyes had been. I took a booth by the window where I could watch my truck and called Vince, a driver I ran winter lanes with. He picked up on the second ring and said, "You alive down there, or did those Tennessee hills swallow you?" I said, "I am fine. But I had something pace my trailer all night near Miller's Creek. Big tracks, wrong stride, eyes at hood height." He laughed once, not mean, just automatic. "Mountain coyotes, man. They get huge and ugly when they cross with strays. You're running on fumes. Get coffee, sleep. Quit staring at shadows." I told him I measured prints with my tire gauge, and he said, "Then you measured coyote prints with a fancy ruler. Take a nap before you invent a werewolf." He kept talking about reefer rates and fuel surcharges, trying to move me back into normal topics. I let him because part of me wanted that more than anything. After I hung up, I wrote distances and times in my log margins like it was an incident report. First knock, second knock, first eye contact, horn blast, movement direction, print spacing. Numbers calmed me. A waitress topped my cup and asked if I was all right. I said I was just tired from the road. At the counter, a deputy in a tan jacket came in, ordered eggs, and took the stool nearest the register. I watched him for a minute, then decided I would sound less unstable if I kept it simple. I walked over, introduced myself, and asked if he had a minute. He turned halfway on the stool and listened while I stuck to facts. I parked near the creek pull-off, had large animal sign around my rig, and something aggressive enough that I had to use the air horn to push it off. I got photos. I am not asking for a search team, just whether there have been reports. He chewed once, swallowed, and said, "You probably found bear sign. Tourists read tracks wrong all the time, especially in thaw mud. We got a cold snap. Critters move odd." I said, "These prints shifted from 4 to 2? He gave me a look that was not hostile, just practiced. Fatigue can do things to depth perception. Stress reaction too. You from Michigan, right? Long run. Get sleep and daylight on it." That phrase landed harder than I expected. Stress reaction, like my senses had become a rumor. I showed him 2 photos anyway. He glanced, shrugged, and said, "Could be overlap. Could be prank boots. Could be bear stepping in old dog prints. Hard to say from pictures." Then he softened his tone a little. If you see an animal actively threatening you, call it in. Otherwise, stay on paved lots. Creek bottoms carry sound weird and spook folks. He turned back to his plate. Conversation over. I went back to my booth, angry at him for dismissing me and angry at myself for caring what he thought. I finished breakfast, paid, and drove back toward the pull-off in full daylight, because leaving without another check would have bothered me for months. Morning made the valley look ordinary again. Sun hit the upper branches. A dog barked from one house. A pickup crossed the bridge. Normalcy returned so cleanly it almost felt staged. I parked, took my flashlight and gauge, and walked the creek edge from the bait shop side to the limestone cut above the lot. In daylight, evidence was worse, not better. Not. The saplings I had noticed at night were part of a wider path where brush had been pushed down in a straight line toward my parking spot. Not trampled like deer movement, more like repeated heavy passage by one large body. On a flat rock near the water, I found smeared mud with shallow grooves across it. 4 parallel marks that looked like claws, dragged lightly while turning. 15 yards farther on, under a tangle of willow, lay what was left of a deer. It had not been scattered or torn up the way coyotes usually work. Ribcage opened clean, organs removed with an efficiency that looked deliberate. There was almost no sign of frantic feeding, no broad mess, no drag marks beyond a short pull from the bank. It looked less like hunger and more like examination. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to force the scene into a known category. Bear. Feral dogs. Human poacher with tools. Each option had pieces that fit and pieces that did not. I tried to convince myself that mixed sign could create false patterns, that predator behavior varied, that I was primed by a bad night. But every time I looked at those claw grooves on stone, the memory of the breathing returned, close and controlled. I knew what random sounded like in woods. This was not random. On my way back, I stopped at the bait shop again. The same man in the knit cap was restocking shelves. I asked if he had seen large animals near the creek lately, maybe a problem bear. He kept his eyes on a pegboard of lures and said, "Bears are sleeping this time of year unless something is wrong." I said, "Something is wrong." He paused, then gave a dry half laugh that held no humor. People hear things in that hollow when the cold settles. Best thing is do your business in daylight and keep rolling. I pushed once more. "You told me to lock my doors last night. Why?" He finally looked at me. "Because locked doors are better than unlocked doors." That was all he offered, and it told me more than a full explanation would have. He was not surprised. He was managing his own boundary with whatever lived in those ridges. I spent the afternoon doing what I could defend on paper. I checked under my hood for loose grounds and found nothing. I inspected every side marker, battery cable, and harness clip, all clean. I bought 2 additional road flares, fresh flashlight batteries, and a can of pepper spray meant for big animals. I called dispatch and asked to keep my overnight where there was full lighting and camera coverage. I did not mention why. I told them I wanted better access for an early dock. That part was true. By late day, I took one more pass by the creek road, staying in the cab this time, scanning shoulders and culverts for tracks. At the limestone cut above the water, I saw a county trail sign bolted to 2 posts. Something had rubbed one post hard enough to strip bark and leave dark hair snagged in a split. I didn't get out to collect it. I measured height from the cab by comparing it to the sign edge and seat line. The top of that rubbed section sat near 7.5 feet. Dusk came early in the hollow. I started to turn out toward the highway when motion crossed my mirrors on the ridge side. Too fast to resolve, dark against darker brush. I braked and looked up at the sign again. For 1 second, maybe less. A full outline stood beside it in moon-thin light. A forward-leaning shape, on hind legs, bent wrong for a man, shoulders rising above the sign by close to a foot. Then it stepped back into cedar shadow without a sound. My hands were already moving, gear engaged, truck rolling. But in the mirror I caught the last detail that took this from fear into certainty. As I pulled away, that shape did not chase. It tracked my route from the ridge, matching my speed through the trees, keeping parallel like it was learning my pattern for later. I kept my foot steady on the throttle and told myself not to do anything dramatic. The county road out of Miller's Creek curled along the water for another half-mile before it joined the highway, and there were only 2 places wide enough to turn a trailer around without burying tires in the ditch. I knew the road now, knew where the shoulder dropped, knew where the bridge narrowed. That gave me something to hold on to, while the shape in my mirror moved through cedar trunks like it had memorized every gap. It stayed mostly hidden, but every few seconds I caught a dark vertical line where no vertical line should have been. I checked speed. 28, then 30. In the mirror, the movement matched without hurry. My headlights swept a bend and caught fog, lifting off the creek in low strips. The vapor made every branch look doubled. I clung to that as an explanation because fog can play tricks that feel personal when you are tired enough. I told myself I was primed for fear after the prince and the carcass and the deputy shrug. I told myself a black bear can stand, can move in odd bursts, can look taller than it is when terrain drops behind it. I repeated those facts like I was reading from a handbook. Then my right mirror flashed with 2 points of reflected light, amber green, too level, too far apart, and high enough that my shoulders locked in place before I could talk myself down. I eased off the throttle and let the truck drift to 20. The eyes drifted too. They were not bright like a deer's white glare. They held color, a green edge around amber centers, like old sodium lights seen through bottle glass. I blinked hard and looked away at my gauges, then back to the mirror. Still there, pacing the tree line. I rolled my window down 2 inches despite the cold. Wind pushed in, carrying creek damp and that same wet fur rot. Heavier now, threaded with something metallic that reminded me of hot brakes. My own breath sounded shallow in my ears. Outside, over tire hiss on frost, I heard a low inhale that rose and snagged, then exhaled rough and wet. It came from my right, not far. At the first wide spot, I pulled onto gravel and stopped without setting the brake hard enough to clack. Engine idled. Lights stayed up-road. I didn't turn toward the trees right away. I sat with both hands on the wheel and counted to 5, then 10, like I did in whiteout conditions when visibility disappeared and panic wanted to write the next move. I reached for my flashlight but left it on the seat. Too much light from me would flatten depth and kill my night vision. I knew that. I also knew I was stalling. Finally, I turned my head and looked through the passenger glass. The brush line across the ditch looked empty for 1 second. Then the 2 reflections appeared again, motionless now, between forked trunks on a slight rise. With the ditch depth and bank angle, those eyes sat somewhere around 7 feet off the road. I measured automatically using what I could see. Fence post height, brush top, the slope break near the limestone face. Deer did not stand there like that. Coyotes did not stand there like that. A person with a headlamp would have had a body outline, coat color, hand movement, breath cloud in the beam. I saw none of that, just eyes fixed on my cab with no blink. I clicked my high beams on. The reflections flared bright and held. No head turn, no startle response. I clicked back to low, then high again, running a quick test for retroreflective tape or road sign artifact. Same result. The eyes stayed exactly where they were through both settings, which ruled out half the easy answers in one move. My mouth had gone dry enough that swallowing hurt. I reached for the radio mic to call this in and stopped with it halfway up. What was I going to say in plain language another driver would accept? 2 lights in woods. Strong smell. Breathing near road. I could already hear Vince chuckling and asking how much sleep I had banked. The engine coughed once, and my dash dimmed, then recovered. That little flicker lit my temper as much as my fear. I popped the parking brake, turned the wheel toward center, and nudged forward 6 feet to shift the angle. The eyes tracked that 6 feet with me, no lag, no searching movement, as if they were tied to my position and nothing else in the world mattered. I stopped again. This time the reflections dipped behind brush for 2 beats and came back higher, like whatever carried them had stepped up onto the bank. The inhale-exhale sound followed, louder, chesty, with saliva in it. I felt the skin rise on my forearms under my jacket. I grabbed the flare gun off the passenger seat and kept it low by my right thigh. My mind split in 2 at that point. One side stayed technical, running options. Reverse and spin, risked jackknife on frost. Forward was clean to the bridge. Horn might push it back or trigger a charge, unknown. Keep cab sealed, no outside exposure, no heroics. The other side of my mind was older and simpler, the part that knows when something is looking at you as food, threat, or challenge. That side kept saying, "Move now. Move now." I pressed the air horn in a short burst. The blast slapped off the ridge and rolled back. The eyes vanished instantly, not down like a deer dropping, but sideways with speed I had trouble tracking. A lateral blur through brush at a height that kept my stomach tight. Branches snapped in a line parallel to the road. Then silence dropped again. Not quiet. Absence. I held still, horn hand ready, scanning for reflection return. Nothing. The smell lingered, then thinned, as if the wind had turned with whatever moved away. I should have driven then without another thought. Instead, I sat there for maybe 40 seconds, trying to stitch what I had seen to anything I already understood. I tried owl eyes first, because owls can reflect weird in beams. Wrong spacing, wrong height, wrong movement. I tried 2 animals overlapping. That failed when I replayed the synchronized slide and steady level line. I tried human prank, 2 reflective markers on a pole. That failed on the breathing and the speed through brush, dense enough to stop a person cold. Each explanation lasted less time than the one before. I knew it. I hated it. I still kept trying, because accepting the alternative meant admitting I had no category left to put this in. A pickup came around the bend from the highway, headlights low and yellow, and passed me going toward the creek. I waved him down with my marker lights and pointed at the shoulder, but he rolled right by without slowing. In his taillights, I saw nothing move at the tree line. The normality of that irritated me more than it comforted me. Another man could drive through the same road and catch only frost and water and dark trees. I was the one stopping on a cold shoulder with a flare gun in my lap, trying to reason with two eyes in the brush. If there is dark irony in this, it is that I had spent years making fun of drivers who jumped at noises in rest areas, and now I was one bent over a steering wheel bargaining with his own senses. I put it in gear and eased back onto the road. The bridge came up ahead. Concrete rails striped with old salt. Moonlight leaked through thin clouds and laid a silver skin on the creek. As my cab reached midspan, my right mirror caught movement on the limestone cut above the far bank. I glanced once and looked away, then snapped back, because my brain had not accepted the shape on first pass. It stood on the ledge above the trail sign I had measured earlier, clear against the pale rock and sky. This was not eyes only anymore. This was mass, posture, proportion. The figure stood bipedal, tall enough that its shoulders rose above the sign top by close to a foot, maybe more from my angle. Its neck angled forward from broad shoulders and the back sloped into hips set high, and legs bent at a backward joint like a running canine frozen upright. Arms hung long, not to human thigh length, but lower, with forearms heavier than they should have been. Fur covered it in dark clumps that broke its outline at the edges. No clothing lines, no gear, no reflective patches. Nothing manufactured. Just a body built wrong for every animal I had logged in my head over 42 years. I kept rolling because stopping on a bridge with nowhere to go was how men make bad situations final. My hands shook anyway. The thing turned its head with my truck, smooth and deliberate. Moon hit one eye and flashed that same amber green. Not a shine from randomness. A direct return like it chose when to show itself. It took one step along the ledge, and I got a better read on its gait. The foot placement was careful, almost quiet by design, but each step covered ground fast, as if all that weight could launch from stillness without warning. Tail was not long, like a wolf, more a thick stump at the base, hard to see in shadow. Its chest looked deep, barrel-shaped, built for lung volume. At the end of the bridge, I had to slow for a tight right curve. My headlights swept the cut and gave me a full-side silhouette for maybe 3 seconds, maybe 4. Long muzzle. Ears pinned back against the skull. Shoulder line high and roped with muscle under fur that looked wet or matted. I saw one hand lift from its side and brace on rock as it shifted stance, and the fingers were separate, long, tipped with pale claws that caught light. Hands, not paws. That detail hit me hard enough that I felt my stomach drop like I had missed a step in the dark. I talked out loud just to keep from freezing inside my own head. Bear. It is a bear standing weird. Mange, maybe. Bad angle. Keep driving. My voice sounded thin in the cab. I kept adding facts in a flat tone. No roadblock, no impact. Keep speed stable. Get to lights. It helped for about 20 seconds. Then, in the left mirror, I saw it drop from the ledge to lower ground in one controlled motion that looked too coordinated for panic or clumsy descent. It did not crash. It flowed down and disappeared behind brush at road level, matching my direction again. I pushed harder on the throttle and let the engine pull. The road climbed away from the creek through a cut lined with scrub pine. My headlights reached a trail pull-out on the right, then a weathered signboard, then open shoulder. Empty. For half a mile I saw nothing but trees and frost and my own beam. I started to believe I'd finally outpaced it. Or maybe it had peeled away once the creek territory ended. Then a dark shape crossed the road 50 yards ahead, from right to left. too quick for full detail, but tall enough that its back cut across the lower branches as it passed. No eye shine that time, just mass and motion and a thud in the suspension as my right steer tire hit the ridge of displaced gravel it left behind. I did not brake. I held lane and drove through the space it had just occupied. The smell punched through my vents in a dense wave and vanished as fast. In the mirror, I caught brush whipping on the left shoulder, in a line running uphill. It paralleled me for another 100 yards, then dropped out when the highway lights finally showed through the trees. I felt my jaw unclench for the first time in 10 minutes. I pulled into the first lit turnout near the junction and left the engine running. Sodium lamps hummed overhead. A vending machine buzzed by the restroom wall. 2 cars sat near the far curb with frost on their roofs and no one inside. Normal fixtures, measured distances, things with names. I checked mirrors again and saw only darkness beyond the lot edge. I took my logbook and wrote while my hands still shook, because if I did not pin details down immediately, my brain would sand them smooth into something easier. Time at bridge, sign height reference, shoulder comparison, gait notes, hand morphology. That last phrase looked ridiculous on the page, like I was trying to turn panic into science by force. I kept writing anyway. Then I sat back and stared through the windshield at the road I had just climbed out of. I tried one last time to convince myself I had seen a sequence of ordinary things stitched into a nightmare by fatigue, cold, and expectation. First lights in trees, then a bare silhouette on rock, then a large feral dog crossing ahead. 3 separate events, each explainable if taken alone. That was the story I built. The version a sensible man could carry into daylight without sounding cracked around the edges. I repeated it until the words went flat. Even then, behind that careful version, another truth stayed put and would not move. The eyes had watched me like a thinking thing, and the silhouette on that limestone cut had moved with intent I could feel in my bones. I sat there under the sodium lamps, with my logbook open on my thigh, reading the last line I had written until the words lost meaning. My pen was still in my hand. My knuckles were white around it. The turnout should have calmed me, and on paper it did. Light overhead, hard pavement, 2 cameras, on a pole by the restrooms. Highway noise in the distance. A man could list those facts and sound sane. The trouble was that my body kept acting like I was still on that creek road, still boxed in by trees, still measuring eye height in the dark. I watched my mirrors every few seconds without deciding to do it. Every black patch beyond the lot edge felt active. I picked up the radio mic and called dispatch. I kept my voice flat and practical. Unit 74, I need confirmation on that overnight request. I do not want the creek pull-off. I want full lighting in traffic. The night dispatcher Carla came back after a pause. Copy that, Ray. Best option is the old aggregate staging lane by the produce co-op. Concrete barriers, yard lights, 1 entrance. It is 8 miles east of you. You good to drive? I looked at my hands, then at the road. I am good to drive, she said. All right, drop me a check call when you are parked. It was a short exchange, maybe 30 seconds, and I clung to it because routine language still worked. I pulled out of the turnout and kept to posted speed. No heroics, no sudden lane changes. The highway cut through low ridges and open pasture, and for the first few miles I saw only taillights far ahead and dark tree lines set back from the shoulder. I started to believe distance had solved it. Then, near mile marker 14, my right mirror caught a movement above road grade on a parallel slope. Not a clean shape, just dark mass pacing through scrub cedar where moonlight hid in strips. It stayed with me for maybe 10 seconds, dropped behind rock, and vanished. I told myself it was a deer running ridge contour. I ran that explanation through my head 3 times. My pulse did not buy it. The co-op staging lane sat off a service road behind chain link and stacked concrete barriers. The kind of place dump trucks use at dawn and nobody visits at midnight. 2 pole lights threw pale cones over the loading apron, leaving deep bands of shadow between barriers. I keyed in through the gate, parked nose out with my trailer angled to keep one side protected, and left enough room to pull straight if I had to leave fast. I called Carla back, gave location and time, and said I would run a final walk around. She said 10-4, get some sleep if you can. I said I would. I already knew I would not. Outside the cab, the cold had sharpened. My breath came in white ribbons that drifted under the trailer. The co-op yard smelled like wet dust, diesel residue, and old grain. No creek noise here, no frogs, no willow tangles, just distant highway hum and the buzzing ballast of the yard lights. I wanted that to mean safe. I started my walk around from the tractor nose, light low, checking tires, seals, kingpin area, landing gear. On the trailer's passenger side, halfway back, I found mud smears on the lower panel that hadn't been there when I left the turnout. They were set high enough that a crouched person could have done them, but the streaks were narrow and curved, 4 lines together like fingers dragged with claw tips leading. I touched one with a gloved hand. Still damp. I stepped back and scanned the fence line. Beyond the chain link lay a drainage ditch and then scrub woods thick as wire brush. Light reached maybe 20 yards and died. I listened. Nothing moved. I reasoned somebody from the yard could have brushed the trailer earlier, left old marks. I only noticed now because I was primed to see threat in dirt. I kept walking. At the rear doors, my seal was intact. At the driver's side landing gear, I crouched to check the crank handle and heard a soft contact under the trailer. Not a scrape, more like weight settling onto gravel. I froze where I was, one knee bent, flashlight beam cutting a hard white triangle under the trailer belly. For a second I saw nothing but cross members and frost. Then something shifted in the darkness opposite me, just beyond the beam's edge, and a long shape slid forward low to the ground. It was not a paw. The hand came first, if hand is the right word. 4 long fingers with a thumb set lower, each tipped with pale hooked claws that clicked once against a crossbar as it gripped and released. The skin between fur and claw looked dark gray and thick, not pads, not hooves. The forearm behind it was roped with muscle under wet, clumped fur, and the fur was not uniform like a shepherd dog or a coyote coat. It hung in uneven ridges, matted in places, thinner along a scarred strip where skin showed through. I jerked the beam up on instinct and caught a wedge of muzzle as it pushed into the light from the far side. Long snout, black nose slick with moisture, lips drawn back, just enough to show narrow teeth in front and heavier tearing teeth farther back. Saliva strung between them and swung when it inhaled. One ear lay pinned flat against the skull. The other twitched toward me like it was triangulating my breathing. I never saw the full head in one clean frame. I got it in flashes, pieces between shadows and steel supports, and somehow that made it worse because My brain had to build the whole from broken parts, while fear rushed ahead of reason. I stood up too fast and hit my shoulder on the trailer side, dropped the flashlight, snatched it back, and backed away. The thing moved under the trailer with me, smooth and silent except for gravel compressing under weight. Its pace matched mine exactly, keeping to the dark side, where the lights did not reach. I could hear its breathing now with no doubt left. Deep intake, wet catch, rough exhale, close enough that I felt each burst in my chest, like pressure changes. I ran for the cab. My boots slipped once on frosted gravel, and I slammed into the step, hauled myself up, and yanked the door shut hard enough to rattle the window. Locks down, engine on. My hands were shaking so bad I fumbled the key twice before it caught. The cab filled with the vibration of idling diesel. I grabbed the flashlight again and aimed through the passenger window toward the trailer gap. Nothing there. Then the shape rose at the front corner of the trailer, halfway in shadow, and I got my first clear partial view above ground. It stood hunched, not fully upright, shoulders broad enough to block the work light on the pole behind it. Fur dark brown to black, clotted from damp. Neck thrust forward from the chest in a way that read canine and human at the same time. The muzzle was long and wolf-like, but the eyes were set with a forward focus that felt wrong when they landed on me. Arms hung low, elbows bent, hands flexing open and shut, as if testing grip. The legs were bent backward at the lower joint, digitigrade, built for burst movement. And the way it held still, measuring distance and angle, told me this was not a panicked animal trapped by lights. It was making decisions. I hit the air horn. The blast ripped through the yard and shook the glass. The creature flinched, not from fear so much as sensory overload, turned its head aside and bared more teeth in a tight grimace. It did not bolt. It stepped back one pace, eyes never leaving me, then moved sideways into shadow with a deliberate stalking gait. I kept the horn down in pulses. 3 seconds on, 1 off, forcing sound into every dark corner around the cab. On the 3rd pulse, I saw it pass behind the concrete barrier line and disappear toward the ditch beyond the fence. I did not leave the cab for 20 minutes. I sat with the horn button under my palm and watched mirrors until my forearm cramped. Nothing returned to the lights. No second pass, no eye shine, no branch movement I could trust. When I finally unclenched, I noticed I was breathing in short bursts, matching the rhythm I had heard under the trailer. I had to force myself to slow down. The sensible plan was to stay inside until dawn and be done. Then another thought worked in, colder than panic. If it had reached my trailer in a fenced-lit yard this fast, it had tracked me from the turnout. It had not lost me on the highway. It had not guessed where I would stop. It had followed. That changed the math. I killed the cab dome light and sat in darkness so I could see outside better. Minutes passed. A set of headlights came down the service road and slowed near the gate, then continued on. No one entered. I checked my phone. 2 bars. I texted Vince 1 line. Something followed me to a fenced yard. Not joking. He sent back after a minute. Sleep, Ray. You are spiraling. Call me at daylight. I did not answer. I did not have language left for him. Around 3:15, there was a soft tap on the driver door below the window. Not a branch. Not gravel thrown by tires. A single, precise tap. I froze, stared at the glass, and counted to 10. Nothing. Then another tap, Same spot, same force. I lifted my flashlight and snapped it on, beam tight through the side window. The step was empty. No body at the door. But on the painted metal below the handle were 4 wet streaks angled upward, fresh enough to bead. I hit the horn again and held it. The yard lights hummed, my ears rang, and when I released the horn I heard movement at the rear of the trailer, quick and heavy, then silence. This went on for the next hour in cycles. Quiet long enough to question myself, then a sign too specific to dismiss. A scrape under the catwalk, a thump against the trailer wall from outside camera range. One slow drag sound along the passenger side like claws on aluminum. Light pressure, not trying to break in, just letting me know it was there. I stayed locked in with the engine idling and the flare gun across my lap, watching gauges and mirrors and shadows until each minute felt like 10. At 4:20, my bladder forced a decision I hated. I had a portable bottle in the cab, and dignity was no longer relevant, but I still needed to stretch and reset my head. I cracked the window 3 or 4 inches for air and immediately caught the wet fur stench so strong I gagged. It had been right outside the door again, close enough to fog the glass if the temperature had been a degree warmer. I shut the gap and sat there with my jaw tight until the urge to move passed. A little before first light, gray started pooling behind the barriers. The hard black edges of the yard softened. I waited for enough visibility to see the full perimeter, then geared up for another walk around with a plan. Door open, quick scan, no more than 90 seconds outside. I took the flashlight, flare gun, and my tire thumper and stepped down. The yard looked empty. Wind had picked up, carrying dust across the concrete in low sheets. I moved fast along the driver's side and stopped dead at the front of the cab. My thermos, which I had left in the shallow dash tray by the driver window all night, sat on the hood against the windshield wiper. I knew I hadn't put it there. I would have remembered opening the door in those cycles. The lid was still on. Around the stainless body were deep indentations, not crushed flat, but pressed in by something with long, narrow points. 4 on one side, 1 on the other. A grip pattern. I stared at it and felt a drop in my stomach, colder than the air. The window seals were intact. Doors had stayed locked, which meant sometime during those hours while I was blasting the horn and watching the wrong side, it had climbed onto the step, reached through the window opening I made for a few seconds earlier, and taken what it could touch. Not random damage, not hunger, a demonstration. I set the thermos down and kept moving. At the passenger side toolbox, the latch hung open. Inside, 1 unopened pack of road flares was gone. On the gravel by the fence, I found the empty cardboard sleeve torn down one side, the flares themselves missing. 10 feet farther, at the ditch edge, 1 flare lay bent and split. Powder spilled bright red into frost like paint. The others were not there. I scanned for tracks and found them layered over each other. Canid impressions at first glance, then deeper 2-point loading where stride lengthened into bipedal steps. The path led from my cab door to the ditch, then along the fence line to a spot where chain link bowed outward from pressure. I followed that line with my light and found my yellow safety vest hanging from the fence on the outside, snagged high on a broken tie wire. I had kept that vest on the passenger seat all night. Now it was out there, chest height on a 6.5-foot fence, as if something had carried it off and dropped it where I would see it at dawn. There were muddy streaks across the reflective strips and 1 long tear through the fabric, clean and straight. I stood in that gray morning with my thumper in one hand and the torn vest in the other, and every practical story I had built collapsed at once. Animals raid trash, steal food, spook easy prey, move by instinct. This thing had tested my blind spots, paced my exits, tapped where my attention lived, taken objects tied to my habits, and arranged evidence to be found in sequence. It was studying me. More than that, it was shaping my movement. I got back in the cab and locked down, breathing hard through my nose, and said it out loud because hearing it made it real in a useful way. It knows me now. My voice sounded steady. My hands did not. I started the engine, checked the gate, and planned the next move like a hazard response. Daylight fuel, no isolated roads, no stops without multiple witnesses, no assumption that distance meant separation. For the first time since Miller's Creek, I stopped thinking of myself as a driver passing through strange country and started thinking like prey that had been marked. I rolled out of the staging lane with daylight just starting to build, gate rattling behind my trailer, and the torn safety vest folded on the passenger seat like evidence I had not asked to carry. The service road was empty. Frost glazed the shoulders in a white crust that crackled under my steer tires when I cut wide at the first turn. I kept scanning mirrors, then forcing myself to look forward, because that was the only way to keep the truck centered and the trailer out of the ditch. Every instinct told me to point north and not stop until I crossed state lines. Every practical obligation said I still had a pickup window, a dispatch chain, and a bill of lading tied to that co-op network around Miller's Creek. I called Carla again before I hit the highway. I need an exception. I am not going back near the creek roads. Her voice came through with morning traffic in the background. Ray, I can reroute after pickup. Right now the load is assigned and perishables are staged. You miss the window, receiver rejects, and we eat it. What is going on? I stared through the windshield at the thin fog in the low fields and kept my tone flat. Large animal activity. Repeated contact with equipment. I do not feel safe on isolated pull-offs. She was quiet for 2 beats. Can you run to the truck stop at exit 49 and wait in public until dock opens? I will note a safety concern on your file, but I cannot cancel this load from here. Copy. Ray, if you are in immediate danger, call emergency services. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I had done exactly that in every polite version available and gotten the same look in different voices. Stress, fatigue, misread sign. I told her I would check in at the truck stop and clicked off. Exit 49 had a 24-hour place with 6 diesel lanes, a diner, and enough cameras to make me feel like I existed again. I topped fuel, parked between 2 day cabs, and walked inside with the tire thumper tucked under my arm like it belonged there. The morning crowd was thin, mostly local contractors and 2 drivers arguing whether over eggs. Normal talk, normal complaints, normal bodies moving through bright fluorescent light. I washed my hands and watched them shake under the dryer. I could not stop the tremor. I called the county non-emergency line from a back booth near the vending machines. A dispatcher answered, clipped and tired. I need to report repeated aggressive animal contact near Miller's Creek and the produce service roads. I have physical damage and track photos. Any injuries right now? Not right now. Any animal in sight right now? No. Then we log it as wildlife complaint. A deputy can swing through when available. I need someone now. It followed me across 2 locations. A pause. Keyboard clicks. Sir, if no immediate threat is visible, response priority is low. Avoid the area and contact wildlife resources at daylight hours. Daylight had already arrived. I thanked her because anger wastes time, then ended the call. I messaged Vince the least dramatic sentence I could manage. It is still on me. I am at exit 49. He sent back a thumbs up emoji, and 30 seconds later, you need sleep. By 6:40, the truck stop had filled enough that I did not want to leave it, which meant I had to. The pickup clock was running, and sitting still in one place too long was beginning to feel like waiting in a trap of my own design. I checked mirrors, rolled out with traffic, and took the service route back toward the co-op district. The cold snap had shut down local movement more than I expected. School buses were off the road. Side streets were empty. Farm dogs that had barked yesterday were silent behind fences. The whole valley carried that paused feeling again, the one that made your ears strain for sounds that never arrived. At the co-op gate, the guard shack was dark. No truck in front of me, no forklift noise, no dock chatter. Just two floodlights over the loading lanes, buzzing and humming in the hard morning air. A chain hung open across the entry lane, as if someone had started shift and walked away. I keyed the intercom. Static answered. I tried again. Nothing but a thin electrical hiss. I should have left right then. I knew it, and I ignored it. My rational brain still clung to one stubborn rule. If there's a known schedule and a known location, stay with that system, because systems keep people alive. I pulled into lane 3, where concrete barriers lined the passenger side and the creek embankment dropped beyond them at a steep angle of frozen mud and rock. It was a narrow slot, just enough room to straighten a trailer before backing to the dock. If anything came from the barrier side, there was no shoulder to bail onto. If anything came from the dock side, my trailer blocked escape on foot. I noticed all of that while setting my brakes, because tactical thinking had become automatic. The silence settled in layers. First, the distant highway hum faded. Then a pair of crows lifted out of a sycamore and left without calling. Then I realized I could not hear the creek, even though I was parked less than 60 yards above it. The air through my vent changed a second later and brought the same wet fur stench, thick enough to coat the back of my tongue. I killed the engine and listened. One scrape came from the concrete barrier, low and deliberate, as if claws dragged across aggregate just to test texture. Then a heavier sound behind the trailer, one impact against the door bars, not a random bump, a strike with weight and intent. I reached for my phone to record and saw the screen freeze on a black frame. Battery showed 62%. The touch controls did not respond. I hard reset it with numb fingers, watched the logo flash, and by the time it came back, the next impact had moved to the passenger side wall. I took a breath, then another, and talked myself through options. Stay in cab, horn and lights, call for help, hold position until other trucks arrive. That was plan 1. Plan 2 was worse, and sat under it like a trapdoor. If this thing got me pinned in a dead lane before witnesses showed up, I was done. I told myself not to pre-panic. I told myself men survive bad odds by making the next correct move, then the next one. I knew that from ice roads, chain failures, brake fires, all the ordinary ways a truck can kill you if you freeze. My radio hissed with no call sign, just burst static in a low tone that rose and dropped. Then, over that hiss, breathing came through the open vent to my right. close, deep, wet at the end of each exhale. I turned my head toward the passenger mirror and saw nothing but barrier top and frost. I thumbed the air horn and held it down. The blast exploded in the lane, bounced off concrete, and cut off into dead quiet, so abrupt it made my ears ring harder than the horn itself. When the ringing thinned, it stood at the front corner of my trailer in full floodlight. Distance was less than 20 yards. No branch cover, no fog, no mercy of partial view. Just the entire animal, fully exposed and fully real, turning its shoulders toward my cab, with a controlled, deliberate step that looked almost human until the rest of it moved and erased that thought. It was around 8 feet tall when it straightened, maybe a little more with the neck raised. Barrel chest, broad and deep, fur clumped dark with lighter patches along scars on the left flank. The neck carried 2 upright for a wolf, 2 forward for a man, ending in a long muzzle lined with wet black lips and teeth that sat visible even with the jaw mostly closed. Ears pinned back against the skull. Eyes amber yellow with a green rim that caught the floodlight and did not wash out. Its arms were wrong in a way my mind fought to process. Shoulders heavy and high, forearms long and knotted, hands ending in fingered claws, nearly the length of my thumb. Not paws, not hooves. Hands built to grip. The legs were digitigrade, hocks high, lower limbs angled for spring, feet planted in a wide stance that could absorb force and launch without warning. A thick tail stump rode low at the spine base, barely moving. Steam rolled from its mouth in dense bursts, each breath measured, not frantic. The scar on its flank looked old, a pale seam cutting through dark fur from rib to hip. Fresh burn marks striped the chest, where one of the stolen flares must have ignited earlier in the ditch. It smelled like wet hide, old blood, and singed hair. It watched me with an intelligence that had nothing to do with pets or wolves, or any category I'd ever trusted. Its gaze tracked my right hand when I moved toward the dash. Then it tracked the flare gun. Then it came back to my face, confirming what I feared most in that second. It was reading me, not just reacting. I whispered, "You are real," and felt how useless words were. It lowered its head, shoulders bunching. I saw the weight shift into the legs and knew the charge was coming before it moved. I hit the horn, kicked the engine over, and snatched 2 road flares from the side pocket where I kept emergency stock wrapped in a shop rag. I cracked my door enough to strike the first flare against the step edge. Red fire burst bright and violent in my hand, spitting sparks into the cold. The creature lunged. It covered half the lane in a blur, one hand slamming the barrier top and launching off it to cut angle toward my door. I threw the first flare straight at the chest. It struck fur, bounced, and spilled fire down the scarred side in a red cascade. The animal recoiled hard, not retreating fully, more a violent sidestep with a roar that was half bark and half something deeper that vibrated through the cab floor. I lit the second flare and drove it toward the muzzle as it turned back. This one hit just below the eye ridge, bursting sparks across nose and lips. It snapped its head sideways, teeth clacking shut on empty air. I had maybe 2 seconds. I popped the trailer release on reflex, then realized I needed the trailer fixed to create a funnel, not free. I slammed it back and instead dropped the rear trailer gate assembly I used for occasional palletized side access, yanking the lever that let the heavy steel panel swing down into the narrow gap between trailer and barrier. Metal crashed against concrete and bounced once. The creature committed to the charge at the same instant, driving through the slot where it had expected open lane. Its right leg punched into the descending gate, caught at the hock, and jammed. It howled and twisted, one clawed hand carving grooves into the barrier as it fought for leverage. The steel panel held for a heartbeat, maybe two. Long enough. I grabbed the tire thumper, jumped down to the step, and drove every ounce of weight through a downward strike at the snout when it turned toward me. The first hit glanced off bone and fur. The second landed across the nose bridge with a sound like striking wet hardwood. The creature jerked back, jaws snapping inches from the thumper head, breath hot and rank against my sleeve. I hit it again, short and hard, then rammed the thumper shaft across its muzzle as a bar and shoved with both hands. The trapped leg tore free of the gate with a metallic shriek, but the backward momentum carried it off balance into the barrier edge. Its heel slipped on ice glaze, hindquarters dropped, and the full mass slammed sideways into the top of the concrete. For one frozen frame, we were eye to eye at arm's length, its pupils tight, lips peeled, saliva and flare smoke drifting between us. Then it went over. The body rolled beyond the barrier, hit the embankment, and tumbled down frozen mud and rock in a crashing slide. I heard brush snap, then a heavy splash in the creek below, followed by thrashing against current and stone. I did not wait for a second sound. I was back in the cab before my boots knew they had moved. Door slammed. Locks down, engine roaring, air brakes released in one motion I'd performed 1,000 times, and never this fast. I shoved the truck forward, tires spinning once on frost before grabbing, trailer snapping straight behind me as I cleared lane 3 and shot through the open gate. In the mirror, I caught one last glimpse of movement at the creek bank. Dark mass fighting up through willow stems, then dropping back as the current pulled downstream. I did not look again. I held the wheel so hard my forearms burned and drove straight for the highway, horn ringing in my skull, right sleeve torn and wet, where claws had raked cloth, every breath tasting like flare smoke and creek mud. By the time I hit exit 49, my hands were shaking so violently I had to brake with my palm heel to keep my foot from slipping. I rolled under the truck stoplights, parked crooked across 2 spaces, and sat there with the engine idling, alive and half-deaf, and trying to say the sequence out loud before my mind broke it into fragments. A knock hit my driver door glass, and I flinched hard enough to bang my knee on the steering column. A man in a reflective jacket stood outside, one hand up, a Disserot's face tense, but trying to look calm. I cracked the window and heard almost nothing but a high ring. His mouth moved once, twice, and I caught only fragments. "You hurt. Stay put." I nodded like I understood all of it. My right forearm burned where cloth had torn away. Blood had dried in a dark sheet from wrist to elbow with fresh lines where it had started again when my hands shook on the wheel. He opened my door after I unlocked it and helped me down by the sleeve, and the second my boots hit pavement, my ribs folded in on a sharp stab that took my breath. The world tipped left, diesel fumes, fryer grease from the diner vent, hot rubber from idling trucks. All of it hit me at once and made me gag. Someone sat me on the curb by the fuel island. Red and blue wash from a patrol SUV painted the concrete. A woman in EMT gear knelt in front of me and asked my name, age, medications, if I blacked out, if I got thrown from the cab. I answered in numbers because numbers still worked. Distance from contact to cab less than 6 feet. 2 flare strikes, 1 gate drop, creek embankment maybe 15 feet. Time from lane exit to highway under 3 minutes. She held gauze to my arm and said, "Ray, look at me. Did an animal do this?" "Unknown animal," I said, "large, bipedal movement in bursts. I need that written in order." She gave the kind of look people give when they are deciding whether to challenge you or keep you talking. She chose keep you talking. "All right. We will write it in order. You have lacerations on the forearm. Not deep enough for stitches if they stay closed. Ribs are likely bruised. You are also half deaf from blasting your own air horn in a closed space, so quit leaning in and saying what every 5 seconds. That actually pulled a dry laugh out of me, one short sound that hurt my side. She cleaned my arm, taped butterfly closures, wrapped it tight, then checked my pupils twice with a pen light. A deputy took a brief statement while I sat on the ambulance step with a blanket over my shoulders. He smelled like cold air and coffee and asked careful questions in a voice meant for wreck scenes. Where exactly? Which lane? Could it have been a bear? Did I fire a gun? I kept it stripped down. Assault by unknown animal, property damage, defensive use of road flares and tire thumper. Animal fell over embankment into creek and moved downstream. He wrote that, paused, and said the phrase I'd heard in the diner, almost word for word. After high-stress incidents, memory can fragment. We can sort details after rest. 10 minutes later, when I insisted on adding eye height and hand structure, he said it again. Stress reaction can exaggerate perceived scale. I signed the incident form with a hand that would not stop trembling and watched my signature crawl across the line like someone else wrote it. Then I climbed back into my cab because I could not stand being looked at like a man on the edge of a story nobody wanted filed. I did sleep for an hour in the truck stop lot. Maybe less. Boots still on, jacket zipped, flare gun beside my leg. When I woke, my right ear still rang, and my arm throbbed in time with my pulse. The first clear thought I had was simple and cold. If I gave the full version to the wrong room, it would bury me faster than the thing at Miller's Creek ever could. I had seen the deputy's expression settle each time I stepped beyond ordinary wildlife language. I had heard the soft redirect, the polite narrowing, the little institutional move from report to assessment. I was not going to hand strangers my credibility and ask them to keep it safe. I filed a minimal addendum at county records before noon. Unknown animal attack, damaged equipment, personal injury treated on site, no continuing pursuit observed on highway. I left out the eyes, the hand on the trailer crossmember, the thermos moved through the window gap, the vest hung on the fence. All of it. The clerk stamped the pages and slid them back without interest. Paper accepted. Event reduced. In the parking lot, I called Vince. He answered on speaker over road noise. "You okay now?" I said, "I got hurt." This was not coyotes. He was quiet longer than usual, then tried a softer version of the same old lane. Adrenaline can do wild things to perception. You had no sleep. I looked at my wrapped arm and said, "I measured it while it was trying to close on me." He exhaled and said he was sorry I got rattled, and that word rattled ended the call for me. We had known each other 15 years. In that moment, we were speaking different languages. I sent my track photos and trailer gouge shots to one person only, a friend named Caleb, who had run remote logging roads for decades and did not perform skepticism as a personality trait. He replied with one line, "I believe you saw what you saw. and I believe it meant harm. Save originals in 2 places. Do not post location. I followed that exactly. I had already thrown 3 pictures onto a private driver forum in the first panic wave at dawn, and by late afternoon, strangers were guessing coordinates, joking about monster hunts, tagging Miller's Creek by name. I deleted the thread, wiped my social pages, and turned location sharing off on everything in my phone. The isolation hit hardest that second night back in Michigan. My house outside Marquette was quiet in the way I used to crave. I stood at my kitchen sink, looked out at my own dark tree line, and could not make myself take the trash out after sunset. My son's homework sat on the table from earlier in the week. Neat pencil columns and eraser crumbs. Ordinary life in plain sight. I realized then that silence was no longer neutral to me. Silence had become information. 3 weeks later, I sat in dispatch at our terminal with the operations manager and sold my rig share back to the company at a discount just to close the deal that day. He asked twice if I was sure. I told him yes both times. We signed papers in a room that smelled like toner and old carpet, and when it was done, I handed over keys I had carried for years and felt both lighter and ashamed, like I had quit a version of myself I respected. Within another month, I moved into a regional yard driver slot, 40-mile radius, fixed routes, lit facilities, known gates, home most nights. Pay cut hurt. Sleep mattered more. The practical changes came fast and stayed. I installed perimeter lights on all 4 corners of my place, then added motion floods on separate circuits, so one failure would not black out the yard. I put cameras with local storage and battery backup on the garage, the back door, and the tree line break where deer crossed in winter. I cut back brush 30 yards from the house and laid gravel strips that hold prints better than dirt after a freeze. I keep flares in my truck, my garage cabinet, and a sealed pouch in my fishing sled. I got my carry permit and now keep a sidearm legal, maintained, and boringly clean. I quit camping alone. Not maybe. Not when convenient. Fully done. First time my buddies asked, I said no, and left it there. Second time, one of them grinned and asked if I was scared of spooky stories now. He meant it as a joke. I put my coffee down, looked at him, and said, I am scared of making preventable mistakes. He laughed again. We stopped calling each other after that. Another old friend kept retelling a softened version at bars, turning my report into punchlines with tall gestures. I told him once to knock it off. He did not. That friendship died quietly. The people who stayed mattered more than the ones who drifted. My ex-wife, Dana, listened without interrupting when I finally told her the full sequence from the yard lane to the creek tumble. She did not name what it was and did not ask me to prove it. She asked what had changed in my safety planning around pickups, school nights, and storm delays when our son was with me. That was the exact right question. We sat at her kitchen table with calendars open and built a co-parent schedule around check-ins, route texts, and no late handoffs on isolated roads. We became steady in a way we hadn't been in years. Not because old problems vanished, but because both of us took risk seriously in the same practical language. My neighbor Glenn, retired conservation officer, became the other anchor. He came over one Saturday with topo maps, a grease pencil, and the calm of a man who had tracked wounded animals for 30 years without bravado. We marked my normal winter drives, dead zones for cell service, lit pull-offs, sheriff substation hours, and 2 backup fuel stops with cameras. He taught me a simple rule set for remote roads. Never commit to a low visibility lane without a reverse option. Never park where one barrier can trap your door side. Never ignore repeated testing behavior around equipment. He never asked for dramatic details. He just helped me rebuild a framework where decisions beat fear. I live now in that same small house outside Marquette, and my life is not ruined. That matters to say plainly. I work days and some evenings in yard operations. I pay my bills. I cook real food more often than diner food, and I show up for my son in ways I did not always manage before. I still ice fish, but only with 2 or 3 people, always with radios, always with a check-in schedule written before we drill the first hole. If weather shifts, we pack up early. Nobody gives me grief anymore because they have seen I am consistent. Sleep took the longest to repair. The first year I woke hard at certain wind angles, especially when gusts hit the eaves in a wet pull that mimicked that breathing by the creek. I would sit up, listen, run a perimeter camera check from my phone, and wait for my pulse to come down. Therapy helped more than I expected. So did naming what I could control and what I could not. I cannot explain what that creature was. In any scientific category I can defend, I can explain exactly what it did, what I did, and why those choices kept me alive. Every now and then someone hears a stripped-down version and asks whether I think it followed me north or whether there are more of them. I tell them I do not know, and that uncertainty is not a performance. I have had no confirmed contact since Miller's Creek. Cameras at my place have caught deer, foxes, 1 black bear in spring. Nothing else that breaks the frame of known animals. That is good. That is enough. I no longer argue that the world is fully explainable if you just gather better data. I used to say that with conviction. Now I say something narrower and truer. Most things can be measured. Some things can be survived. Those are not the same category. If you are listening to this and deciding whether I am mistaken, I understand. I used to be on your side of that divide. I still keep my logs. I still keep the wrapped thermos in a box in my garage with the old vest and printed photos, not as trophies, just as reminders. The denial is not a plan. I got out of Miller's Creek alive. I changed how I live. And I built a life that works. That is the whole story.